with people all over Australia that have jumped on. And as we do that, we might start with our introduction. So welcome everyone to our monthly Fireside Chat. This is actually our last one for the year, given it's December already. So we thought we'd take this opportunity to enter into the festive season with exploring some strategies to navigate metabolic health and glucose management. My name is Charlotte. I'm an accredited practicing dietitian here at Vively. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, we are joined by Dr. Marc Cohen. Marc is a medical director, university professor, author, poet, entrepreneur, wellness trailblazer, and perpetual student of life. It's quite the bio, Marc. He's been researching and practicing integrative medicine for more than 30 years and has spent more than half of his career as a university professor teaching and researching wellness and contributing to the fields of nutrition, herbal medicine, acupuncture, yoga, meditation, health retreats, fermentation, detoxification, and the list just goes on, Marc. It's incredible. You've published more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers and many books and technical texts on wellness and natural medicine, and are also the author of a couple of children's books as well. And yes, they're hiding behind you there, which is great. You are a past board member of the Global Wellness Summit, past president of the Australasian Integrative Medicine Association, founder of Extreme Wellness Institute, Beautiful Water, and I can't pronounce. Thank you. So you've got quite an extensive list of accolades behind you, Marc. Welcome to Vively.
Well, thank you, Charlotte. It's great to be with you. And yeah, I mean, I've known Michelle Woolhouse for decades now in integrated medicals. Yeah, decades. So
Marc and I, for everyone, Marc and I were on the board of AIMA together. That's how we met at the first holistic health conference in Lorne way back in 1999. So 25 years I think we go back, Marc. Yeah. So Marc is probably one of, I'm just going to add to that. I mean, it's a fair introduction, but Marc is probably one of the Australia's leading wellness experts. So it's a real treat for all of us to have him on today. And he's going to start us off with a poem. As Charlotte mentioned, he is a poet, new to the space, but just as a way of increasing, I guess, his ability to share this incredible wealth of knowledge, which you will all realise by the end of this hour how much Marc has got to share. Take it away, Marc.
Well, thanks, Michelle. And it's great to be here and with you. And I'm sort of a reluctant poet because in medical school, I was always trying to summarise information and make it really easy to remember and understand. And often when I just write down all the different things, or recently, I've been writing down lists of things to remember, and I've always loved Dr. Seuss and poetry, and it just turned out as poems. So I have a poem today which I've never shared before publicly, and it was a poem I wrote after I got really inspired by Jessie Champe, the glucose goddess, and her glucose hacks. And realized, her hacks were great, but she was missing quite a few things, and we can talk about that. So I started writing down all the things that help with, balancing blood sugar and blood sugar spikes. So I started writing them out, and it turned into a poem. So this is a poem that we'll tease them out. These are 20 essential blood sugar hacks. And it's: eat food in the right order, fiber, fat, and protein first. Add a dash of vinegar, and let filtered water quench your thirst. There's no need for counting calories. Just leave the sweets till last. And move your body after meals and avoid those naked carbs. And only eat when hungry. Extend your fast at night. And eat with grace and colour. And enjoy the feast in the first bite. And try eating with the seasons. Enjoy different cuisines. Eat all the different parts of plants, fungi, roots, flowers, fruits, and greens. And enjoy food of many flavours, bitter, salty, spicy, sour, and sweet. And eat living ferments with each meal and give your gut biome a treat. And don't be rigid with your choices. And when push becomes a shove, do what feels right in the moment and eat the foods you love. So there you go. There's 20 little hacks. We can tease that out. Thank you. Because each one of those, you know, we can sort of elaborate on. But that's just a really nice summary, I think, of some of the things we can all do to improve our blood sugar regulation. And of course, improving blood sugar regulation isn't just about diabetes or metabolic syndrome. It's about inflammation. It's about mood swings. It's about hormonal balance. It's about sleep. So, you know, blood sugar regulation is one of the most basic. I mean, I often talk about thermoregulation. You know, I'm the director of the Peninsula Hot Spring Group, and you talk a lot about hot and cold and thermoregulation as being really primitive, but sugar regulation is also a really primitive homeostatic system. And if that's out, everything else sort of starts to go out. So I'm really happy to talk through this and dissect.
Yeah, well, definitely. I've got a few things I want to pick your brain on. Charlotte, I interrupted some of that housekeeping. Did you want to just share with our members today just a little bit of housekeeping for the session?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Marc. That was fantastic. So for those of you that have joined our webinars or Fireside Chats before, we do record these sessions and send them out afterwards, so those that can't make it can don't miss out on the great information as well. We just ask that you keep your microphone off during the session, but at the end of our session, so Michelle and Marc will have a bit of a chat. At the end of our session, we will open it up to questions. So feel free to pop those questions in the chat function as they pop up. You don't have to wait till the end as well, so we can direct those as well. But that's all the Q&A, all the housekeeping, Michelle, so you can take it away.
Beautiful. So I thought we'd just start off and explore the poem that you just shared with us, Marc. So tell us about food in the right order. What do you know about that?
Sure. Well, and again, I've got to give a tribute to Jessie Champay, the glucose goddess, because she became famous on Instagram, I think, when she started publishing her continuous blood sugar monitoring graphs. And Vively, I was really excited to wear my own Vively sugar monitor to see how I could look at that in my own life. But she uses her own data to illustrate principles of blood sugar regulation. And one of the ones that really caught me was she dissected a tuna sandwich and said, if you eat a tuna sandwich, you get quite a big blood sugar spike afterwards. But if you just take it apart, eat the tuna first and the lettuce and the salad and eat the bread last, you don't get that blood sugar spike.
Amazing.
And what that's talking to is our digestion and release of sugar into our bloodstream depends on what's already in our stomach and in our intestine. And if we load ourselves with fiber and fat and protein, then that requires digestive enzymes and digestion to happen, which then slows down gastric emptying. So your stomach's not going to release stuff into the intestine and then into the blood until it's fully digested. So if you've got protein and fiber that needs digesting, it's going to wait a while before it releases that into the intestine. Whereas if you've got just the bread, which is basically carbohydrate, starts bread and carbohydrates, they start getting digested as soon as you put them in your mouth. You get salivary amylase, which is alkaline environment of the mouth. It starts to digest that, and if you eat that first, then that essentially you're adding sugars to your gut, and that just goes straight into your intestine. That's your stomach says that's ready to go. You release that into your intestine, straight into your blood, and you get this big blood sugar spike. And what that does, it causes insulin to be secreted because that sugar has to be put back into the muscles. Insulin's job is to tell them, or to get the blood sugar out of your blood into your muscles. And when that happens, you suddenly get a low sugar, and then you get a bit of a crash. And this is what happens, I think, generally with people. If you have naked carbs, and one of the lines of the poem says, avoid those naked carbs. If you have carbohydrates and sugars without fat or protein or fiber, then you're basically just injecting your blood with glucose. And you get these swings of high glucose, then high insulin, and then very low glucose. And then when you get the hypoglycemia, that's when you get mood swings often. And that's when you get the craving to eat something sweet. And then your gut bacteria, which is pretty much in control of your life, without knowing it. I mean, our modern, mammalian, reptilian brains are really in service of our gut bacteria. And you can talk a lot about, the microbiome. But they would then say, okay, give us more sugar, and you get into this loop. So if you have fiber and fat and protein first, then that gives your stomach something to work on, and you don't get this blood sugar spike by having the carbohydrate straight away. And I'm a really big fan of following cuisines, not following diets and macro micronutrients. But if you think about some of the general practices in modern or in ancient traditional cuisines, in Italian meal, I mean, they have pasta. They eat a lot of carbohydrate, but before that they have the antipasta. They have vegetables usually with a vinaigrette on them. So having vinegar and vegetables which have the protein and the and vinegar. We can talk about vinegar at length when we will. But that's just a natural part of the thing. And then when you have part of their diet and their way of eating, and that way when you have the pasta, it's not getting straight into the blood. You've already got something in your stomach to work on, and you get this slower release of blood sugar.
And they do the same in Asian cultures as well. They'll start with the vegetables and then the meat, and then they fill up on rice as their last
at the end.
Fill up, And the other thing, I lived in Italy for a little while, and every evening they would come out of the community. It was a small Italian town, and everybody would walk after dinner. 20 to 30 minutes, everyone be walking, night, good night, good night, good night, good night. Such a lovely kind of environment, but they're obviously walking off any of that excessive carbohydrate.
That's it. And
which is another one of your lines.
It is. You move your body after meals. And there is also a traditional, in traditional cultures, and even the way some cities are designed, where you have restaurants near a promenade. For dinner, then you go for a walk on the promenade after dinner, so and it's often by a waterside or somewhere, parklands. So you're compelled to go for a walk after dinner rather than you drive through.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, we're missing so many other elements as well. You also mentioned in your poem, fall in love with the first bite. What do you mean by that? Tell us about that.
I mean, the feast is in the first bite. It's not the 10th bite of chocolate cake that's the most pleasurable. It's the first bite of chocolate cake.
Yeah.
And by really appreciating, I mean, and that can happen also, extending your fast at night. When you break your fast, that first exposure to food is where the pleasure comes. And then you've got diminishing returns from subsequent bites. So really savoring your food and it's also eating with grace, eating gracefully. That having the feast in the first bite means you can feast and fast every single day. I mean, we all fast at night, so everybody fasts. And you think, we don't feast every day, but you do. If that feast is in the first bite, you can consider every day being a feast. And
I love that. I love that aspect of savoring, because I mean, I kind of did that as a kid, when I was trying to savor chocolate, which was much rarer in those days than it is now. But like, I would suck it and, put it all over my mouth and make sure that I really, really made it last a long time. I was one of those,
And that's it. And even then, if you have a chocolate bar, if you break that up into 3 bars and have it in separate occasions, you've got 3 lots of first bites. More pleasure out of that same chocolate bar than if you have the whole chocolate bar in one hit.
Yeah, that's right. And what about fasting? Because there's so much kind of stuff about intermittent fasting, and you kind of simplified in the sense of just extending the, as you said, we fast overnight, but some people are eating late at night at 9 o'clock and then waking up, early in the morning or whatever, and having breakfast at 6 or 7. What is your kind of general principles on fasting?
Well, the line before that is only eat when hungry.
Yeah.
So, and I think we were hoodwinked as kids. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and I push back on that. That was actually designed by the breakfast cereal industry to, give you, and to give us massive carbohydrate with sugar on top for breakfast. So you start your whole day with this swings of blood sugar. So I don't know how we manage as kids. We're all having these, even oatmeal or cereal with sugar is going to set your day off with a high blood sugar, and then you're going to crash after a couple of hours and then go in this swing. So the fact that we all fast overnight, and if you wait till you're hungry, and when I say hungry, it's not like being really starving, because that's not good either, but getting to the point where you start to think about food and you can salivate a little bit and you start to imagine the food. That means your body is ready to absorb the nutrients from your meal. If you just eat on top of the last meal and you haven't even fully digested the previous meal, it means you're not going to absorb as much nutrients from that meal. Your body's not primed to get the nutrition from it, and you tend to overeat, and your digestion gets clogged up. You've got all this it's hard work to digest. You have to send blood and resources into your stomach, and you get this overgrowth of bacteria because they have to process all this extra matter, this material that you're giving them, and it just makes you sluggish.
Absolutely.
So only eating when hungry, and when you eat when you're hungry, then you enjoy the feast in the first bite rather than just gorging, and extending your fast at night. So, don't eat until you're really hungry in the morning, and then just extend that. And I generally don't eat my first meal till maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's not because I'm trying to do it. It's not because I'm just waiting till I'm hungry, and I don't get hungry until that time, and that's great. But I'm not saying that's what everyone should do. And you need to, the last lines, and don't be rigid with the choices, and do what feels right in the moment and eat the foods you love. It's really important to enjoy food. And there's a few points that talk to that, saying that, not being rigid with your choices, and not counting calories. Now, if you're just counting calories and saying with a dietitian, it means food is associated with stress. And stress releases cortisol, and cortisol stuffs up your blood sugar regulation. One of the actions of cortisol and stress is to dysregulate blood sugar. So having a relaxed attitude and a healthy attitude and a really loving attitude to your food is loving yourself. Having food as the enemy, I can't eat that because I'm on a diet, I don't want to be fat, I'm scared, I've already had that, I can't eat this. When you set that motion up, you're already releasing cortisol in your system, which is going to give you blood sugar dysregulation, which is going to make you eat rubbish food, because when you have the cortisol, you've got you're in this roller coaster of up and down in blood sugar, rather than the steady release of blood sugar, which then regulates all of our other mental and hormonal and physiological processes.
Absolutely. So tell us about vinegar, because that was another one in your line, and I know that you've been doing lots of experimentations with.
I started a vinegar company in the lockdown. And it was sort of inadvertent. I've got a good friend of mine who has a amazing kombucha company, the Good Brew Kombucha, and Dino Callahan, and he was telling me for years how kombucha fixes everything. I'm saying, yeah, really? Where's the research on this? And I actually looked at the research, and there is lots of research on vinegar and how vinegar balances blood sugar. But when I looked at the research on kombucha, there was like 300 studies on animals and no studies on humans, like none, which I found really curious, because I was a university professor doing natural medicine research, and you see studies done on this herb that's hardly used by anyone, and this, whereas kombucha is a multi-billion-dollar industry, no human studies.
Wow.
So that's interesting. I know how to do research, and this is what I do for a living. I've been doing it for 30 years. Let's get a grant and do some research on it. And we did. So we got a grant, an Oz Industry grant, Innovation Connections Fund, and we did 2 projects, one at RMIT, where I was a professor, and we did a metagenomic study where we analysed the kombucha and the kombucha vinegar, and we looked at the bacteria, the probiotic profile, and found out. And we actually, when you do these big studies, they do 96 little wells at a time, and they do everything in triplicate, which means you can do 32 samples for the same price as one sample. So you may as well do 32 samples. So we measured the vinegar and Dino's kombucha, but we also took kombuchas off the shelf, from supermarkets, to see what are the profiles of them. And a lot of them have 1 or 2 bacteria or no bacteria, whereas the Good Brew had 200 probiotic strains.
Wow.
That's because it's a whole ecosystem. The Good Brew uses a wild fermentation process. So it's like a whole garden, an ecosystem of bacteria. And one of the unusual things we also found, but it has 2.5 times the polyphenols of green tea. Right. And when you make kombucha, you start with green tea and you add sugar in it, you do a fermentation. And this had 2.5 times. So it means when you ferment the tea, you actually make the bacteria and the yeast, and that symbiotic relationship between the yeast, which takes the sugars and turns them into alcohol, and then the bacteria that takes the alcohol and turns them into organic acids. You also get all these other metabolites. So you get these polyphenols, and polyphenols are the healthy plant chemicals. The phenolic compounds are these, ring-shaped compounds, and the flavonoids and things like the anti-aging chemicals like resveratrol in grapes is an anti-aging. It's a polyphenol, and we often think of vinegars as being grape vinegar, wine vinegar, or apple cider vinegar, and both grapes and apples have high polyphenols. But they also have their own sugar, so they'll naturally ferment. Whereas green tea has even more polyphenols than apples or grapes. It doesn't have its own sugars. So you have to add sugar to green tea to ferment it. And if you add sugar to green tea and ferment it, it's called kombucha. If you add honey to green tea and ferment it, it's called Jun, Jun, which is probably even more ancient than kombucha because honey was available before sugars were available. And in that fermentation process, you get these organic acids and you get these polyphenols being reproduced. And so kombucha vinegar is even more healthy in a way than apple cider vinegar because it's higher polyphenol content.
Wow.
And so when we did this research, so we did that research on the polyphenols and the metagenomics, down 200 probiotic strains and twice the polyphenols of green tea. And then we did the first ever human clinical trial of kombucha. And we did that at the University of Sydney, at Jenny Brand-Miller's lab, and she has the sugars lab, and her team really created and promoted the whole concept of glycemic index. That was sort of the home of glycemic index research. So they have a very standard protocol where they give people a standard meal, I think with jasmine rice and peas, with a certain carbohydrate load, and then they measure the blood sugar and the insulin response afterwards. And she was very careful and saying it's not just the blood sugar response, but it's also the insulin response. And a lot of studies don't measure the insulin response; they just do the sugar response.
Right.
So we did this double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized, crossover study, and it was very, very simple and quite a cheap study. And because I had all this expertise in running clinical trials in natural medicine, I was able to, because this was our money now, because we invested in this research. So we got healthy people that came in, and they had the standard meal with either soda water, diet soft drink, and neither of them had any sugar, or kombucha, which had a little bit of sugar in it. And we measured their sugar, or they measured their sugar and the insulin response afterwards. And they found that if you had the kombucha with your meal, you had 20% less blood sugar spike and a 15% less insulin spike after the meal, compared to diet soft drink or soda water. Right. And the soda water controlled for a fizzy drink, and the diet soft drink controlled for an acidic drink because it had the same pH as the kombucha. And that was surprising. And we published that in Frontiers in Human Nutrition. It's the first ever human study of kombucha. You can Google it. It's on Google Scholar or PubMed. And actually, 2 months ago, the second ever human study of kombucha was published. And this was done in, I think, the University of Georgia. Georgetown University, and they actually gave kombucha to diabetic patients for a month. I mean, in our study, we just had healthy people for one dose.
Yeah. They
gave this every day for a month, and they found out after a month of drinking kombucha with a meal, it reduced their blood sugar and their HbA1c.
Wow.
So that was in a diabetic population. So that was published about 2 months ago. So now there's 2 human studies of kombucha which we did, which is pretty exciting. So then I said to Dino, I want in on this. This is an amazing product, kombucha vinegar. And because I wrote these textbooks on natural medicine, if we soak herbs in the vinegar, we can make these herbal tonics. And because I love Chinese medicine, the 5 elements and all of that, I wanted to add leaves, roots, flowers, fruits, and fungi. So all the different parts of plants, which sort of feature my poem, eating all the different parts of plants. And that gives a very broad flavor profile because you've got the rooty and mushroom, fungi, earthy flavors, and then the floral, fruity, sort of higher notes of the flavors. So it makes it well-rounded. And then we selected the herbs based on their properties. So we have one blend for your gut, and one for your brain, and one for your hormones, and one for detox, and one for the immune system. Right. We designed one for blocking spike proteins. So we have 6 different blends. And they're vinegars that are flavored vinegars. And one of the things we also found out in Dino's kombucha And in our kombucha vinegar, it's high in acetic acid, and acetobacter makes acetic acid, but it's also very, very high in gluconic acid, which is made by gluconobacter. And gluconobacter is like the holy grail of fermentation. Like the Shiraz grapes, apparently you can buy gluconobacter for your Shiraz brewing from the Australian Wine Institute. And Dino's kombucha naturally has high gluconobacter. And the gluconic acid, it's like acetic acid, but acetic acid has that sharp vinegary bite to it. Whereas gluconic acid has a tart sweetness to it. It's not sugar, but it actually tastes good. So his kombucha tastes amazing.
Wow.
And our vinegars, they're not as spiky and sharp as just a white wine or a white acetic acid vinegar.
Yeah.
And so they've got high in gluconic acid. They're also very high in polyphenols because of the green tea that I explained. And then they've also got these herbal elements where we soak the herbs in it for a month. And then basically, we only use dried herb. We don't use liquid extract. We get dried herbs. We have these big tea bags. We soak the herbs in these big, IBCs for a month. Then we just pull out the herbal matter, and we end up with these herb-infused, living probiotic vinegars that are amazing to have with a meal.
Amazing. So is it true that we need to, in your research, is it true you have to have the apple cider vinegar or vinegar before a meal, or is it okay just to have it because as we have it on?
I think with the meal, the research we did on the kombucha was with the meal.
Yeah,
so that's alternating bites of the meal with that. So having a salad with your meal with vinegar splashed on it is great. I think Jesse Champagne, Glucose Goddess says have some vinegar in water before your meal. And I think it matters so much when. And I was talking with Jenny Brown Miller about this, and she's the blood sugar expert, Sydney, and we're saying, why did this have such a big effect? And we expect there's a few reasons. One is the polyphenols themselves delay gastric emptying.
Right.
Because they're complex and ringed molecules. When they hit your stomach has to work on them to digest. So that then prevents them just getting squirted straight into your small intestine. So the polyphenols delay gastric emptying. The vinegars themselves they've got 200 probiotic strains that when they hit the warm environment of your stomach, they start to become active and they start to metabolize the carbohydrate. And then you have the effect of the acids and vinegar and acetic acid, but even gluconic acid and malic acid and the other glucuronic acid that are present. They reduce the action of amylase. So amylase, we talked about how digestion starts with amylase, and amylase requires an alkaline environment, and that's why your parotid glands, secrete saliva that's alkaline in your mouth. That starts the carbohydrate digestion. So the acid prevents some of the initial carbohydrate digestion, and then also when you have acid released into your system, that stimulates uptake of glucose from the blood into the muscles.
Right.
So acetic acid will do that. Acetic acid alone, but it's fine to take just white wine vinegar or white vinegar, although it's not as pleasant. But if you have like a living probiotic kombucha vinegar, it's going to be so much better. And the thing is, anyone who's ever made kombucha knows it's super easy to make kombucha vinegar because you just start making kombucha and ignore it. You neglect it for a few weeks or a month or two, and it turns to vinegar naturally. So this is something you can do at home.
And it's in your kits, like because I know you've got a starter pack at home. Does that teach you how to do that?
Dino, he sells that brewery in a box, which is either Jun, and because the Jun SCOBY, that's when you use honey for brewing kombucha. For brewing Jun, it's a different SCOBY because honey is so antimicrobial. You need a more aggressive yeast to start fermenting the honey. You can get a brewery in a box and start doing this at home. Mind you, if you've got anyone who's making kombucha that they'll have heaps of SCOBY that they can give you. And in fact, our vinegars, the bottles you can see behind me are our vinegars. The liquid in those vinegars are a living SCOBY. So if you add sweet tea to any of our vinegars, they'll start to ferment and make kombucha. And then you just ignore that kombucha for a few months, it'll turn to vinegar. We ferment it for about 6 months to get rid of all the sugar and the alcohol. But that's it's so easy to do this at home. We do it we use Dalesford spring water. We get biodynamic sugar from Brazil, and we're now using we're making June using incredible, and we can talk about Manuka honey and glycemic effect of that. So we get Manuka honey, which is even more antimicrobial than normal honey. So we have to have a very aggressive SCOBY to be able to ferment the Manuka honey. And Manuka honey is naturally super high in polyphenols. It's got 44 different polyphenols in Manuka honey that aren't in normal honey.
How many?
44.
Wow.
Yeah, I went to visit University of the Sunshine Coast. There's a whole group there, and Peter Brooks and one of his awesome honours students, Georgia, did her honours thesis on the polyphenols of Manuka honey, and documented 44 different polyphenols that aren't in other honeys. So, and these polyphenols come up again as being really healthy for you, slowing down gastric absorption. And Manuka honey itself is it's quite low GI. It's like 55 on the GI scale compared to 100 for sugar. So, honey is not the sort of the evil sugar that people make it out to be. Although, I mean, that's a whole other story, because they estimate that a third of all the world's honey is fake. It's been counterfeit with corn syrup, rice syrup, sugar syrup. And a lot of people in the world, if they've been buying cheap honey, have never actually had real honey. It's one of the most counterfeited foods on earth. And, So, and then Manuka honey.
I wonder it's got such a bad name.
Well, that's it. It's just sugar syrup if you're buying the cheap honey. And whereas Manuka honey has this MGO, the methyl glyoxal, which is the antimicrobial compound in Manuka honey. It's been very, very well researched, and it's used for wound care, topically, for skin care, and internally. And in fact, Manuka honey will eradicate Helicobacter. So and the thing about so there's a systematic review that was released a couple of years ago on multiple studies on using Manuka honey for stomach ulcers and Helicobacter.
Well, you'd think that your June using Manuka honey would be even more powerful.
Well, there's a study that came out this year, which I'm really excited about. We didn't do it, but what they did is they got Manuka honey and vinegar, and in this study they used white wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, date vinegar, and pomegranate vinegar.
Ooh.
So all of those have high polyphenols. But interestingly, they didn't use kombucha vinegar, which has the most polyphenols than all of these others. And although there's a caveat there. We use really high quality green tea and oolong tea to make the kombucha. It depends on the source of the tea. If you have cheap, not very high quality tea, you're not going to have as many polyphenols in the vinegar. But if you have good green tea, then you're going to have very high polyphenols in your vinegar. But anyway, what they did, they got these vinegars and they diluted them to the point where they weren't bactericidal. And then they got Manuka honey and they diluted that to the point where it wasn't bactericidal. And then they took the diluted honey and the diluted vinegar and combined them together, and they were bactericidal. So there's a synergistic action between honey and vinegar that actually support each other. And I didn't know this, I had this vinegar company, and recently I've just joined the board and invested in, and I'm now director of product development for Gatherby, which has the world's most potent Manuka honey, based in Byron Bay, in Ballina. So it was really a sort of a revelation to me, because I created this vinegar company, not knowing really why. It just seemed like a good idea at the time, and I thought it was great medicine that people would really benefit from. And then I joined this honey company, and then now I've been researching what's called oxymels, OXYMEL, and oxy means acid, and mel means honey. So oxymels are literally food as medicine. And most people know Hippocrates said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." Well, the most common prescription that Hippocrates would prescribe were oxymels, which are vinegar and honey combinations. And vinegar and honey are both preservatives. They can't go off because and when you mix them together, they have this synergistic action of antibacterial action, but they also form a base for any other herbs. So you can put other herbs in them. So it's a base of herbal medicine, like food as medicine. Honey and vinegar are fantastic as a combination.
Well, we had Joanne McMillan on a couple of Fireside Chats ago, and she was talking about olive oil having the same qualities of actually absorbing the herbs as you cook. And as olive oil heats with different combination of vegetables, the polyphenols would be absorbed and there'd be more polyphenol. Like it, so it sounds, you know, similar in that way.
Yeah, I think olive oil is a little bit different because it's a fat, so we'll absorb a lot of the fat soluble nutrients.
Yeah.
Whereas with the vinegar and the honey, and just this recent research, they're actually synergistic.
Yeah.
And that's not just for oral use; it's for topical use as well, which is really interesting. And so we're looking to develop a whole range of oxymals, which can be taken internally. So and when you have it, like vinegar is really quite sour,
Yeah.
honey is very sweet, and they balance.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so you balance it. Although what I found is
that umami, is that what they call umami?
Well, umami is another whole flavor again. That's like
yeah.
You know, mushrooms and
Got a bit salty.
yeah, a bit salty. But if you add something that's bitter, so I've been adding cacao or andrographis, or you know, some of the bitter herbs, dandelion, with the sweet and the sour. So you get the honey and people can do this at home. You can get some vinegar, get the best quality vinegar you can. You know, apple cider. If you can get our kombucha vinegar, our brand's called Extremely Alive, because our products are extremely alive. They're 200 probiotic strains. But you can make your own kombucha vinegar. Get some honey and get the best honey you can afford, which the best honey will be the honey from your local beekeeper. And there's a whole story there where if you have local honey, you're actually taking, you know, not quite homeopathic versions, but you're taking the local pollens that are around in the season, that are in your area. And if it's from a local beekeeper, hopefully it's be raw, unprocessed, unadulterated honey. So to get the best vinegar you can, the honey you can, mix them almost 50-50.
Yeah.
And if it's good honey, it'll take a while to dissolve. Like usually I'm shaking these for about 5 minutes to get the honey to dissolve in the vinegar. But once it's dissolved, it stays dissolved. And then you end up with this incredible sweet and sour base that you can add other herbs to. Mind you, there's a caution there. When you do that, it takes about a week. And if you leave it at room temperature, after about a week, it'll start to ferment. Because once honey has water added to it, once it's over 17% moisture, it starts to ferment and becomes mead. So if you've got these oxymals with vinegar, and if it's a living vinegar especially, and honey together, after about a week, it starts to ferment and bubble. And then it starts to become a little bit alcoholic because there's natural yeasts everywhere. You don't have to add yeast. We'll start to break down the sugars and make alcohol, and the bacteria will take the alcohol and make vinegar. And it goes through this really beautiful process where when it ferments, it becomes effervescent. It starts to become carbonated and fizzy, so it becomes sweet like sherbet. So you end up with this sherbety, sweet, sour drink that's really quite potent. You only need, I've been putting them in these little spray bottles.
Right.
Actually, this one started to ferment. That gap there is just gas that's appeared in there. So, and only like less than a mil will just change your whole attitude, because you get this the biting of the vinegar and the sweetness of the honey soothes your throat, and because Manuka honey and vinegar together, but Manuka honey especially, will break down biofilm. If you have a sore throat or any infection going on, that'll break it down. And the antimicrobial effects of Manuka honey work even with antibiotic resistant bacteria. So even MRSA, methicillin resistant strep, and antibiotic resistant bacteria aren't resistant to honey. So honey is like universal medicine, and in fact, it's been blowing my mind learning about honey too, because the word medicine actually comes from the same origin as mead, and they say that honey is the reason that humans develop consciousness, which is a big statement, but honey's been around for 130 million years, since the start of angiosperms. This really sophisticated relationship between bees and trees and flowering plants. And even small mammals will try and raid beehives, but it's really hard to get into a beehive.
Right, and they're protected.
Yeah, and they say that and honey is also the sweetest sort of treat in nature. They're much sweeter than fruits.
Yeah.
And it's also the most compact form of carbohydrate in nature. And it's not just that, it's portable and durable. It lasts forever. So it preserves other foods. So honey is...
And you know what I love about beehives?
What's that?
Is the queen it's the queen that holds the
Oh
beehive.
yeah, it's a whole matriarchy there.
So it's the matriarch.
Those poor drones.
Yeah.
So
I
what-
mean,
what-
yeah. Sorry, you were going to finish.
I was just going to say that when the first even pre-primates were around, our primate brains need a lot of glucose. And honey was a way to get that glucose and store it. And they say the first ever stone tools used by humans, or even pre-humans, were used to raid beehives, not to kill animals or something. So, to cut the wax off a beehive and to cut into a beehive, that's what stone tools were used before we even used fire. Humans, we get accessing honey, and that having the ability to use honey to give our brains glucose helped us develop a survival advantage and develop greater consciousness. And then when we started using fire was used to smoke out beehives and actually further get honey. So fire and stone tools were great. They revolutionized humanity, but they also have this connection with honey, which is really fascinating for me. I love learning this stuff. Yeah.
I know evolutionary medicine or kind of anthropological medicine is so fascinating and kind of brings it down to these key homeostatic markers, which is what Vival is all about, is to kind of get that really key homeostasis sorted and come back to the basic principles to keep, humans well. But that was such an interesting, passionate exploration of these, really incredible molecules and how they interact. But I wanted to stop being so greedy on your brain and put it out to the audience, because I'm sure we've got some really fascinating questions.
Yeah,
Charlotte
happy.
always loves to lead with her dietitian brain. Come on, Charlotte, what have you got?
I was writing notes as we went along because I do have a couple of questions. I guess and firstly, thank you for telling me about the kombucha vinegar, because I've been making kombucha for a couple of years now, and I've let my latest batch go way too far. So it's good to know that there is a use for that.
Oh, it's amazing in salads. Yeah, just having a shot, adding it to your water bottle, just adding a bit of, a splash of vinegar to your water.
Yes. Oh, that's fantastic. I will definitely not be letting it go to waste, that's for sure, as I get my next brew going. But I was curious with that combination of the vinegar and honey, does that change with heating? So if we were using it in like a culinary, like to dress your veggies, for example, does heat impact the benefits?
I was asking this exact question to the researchers at the University of Sunshine Coast, because I'm working with this company Gather By, which has this amazing Manuka honey, and they've been wanting to use that with one of the big coconut water companies, where they pasteurize the coconut water. And if you put honey into coconut water, you'd have to pasteurize it. And the question was, does pasteurizing, and this was like 2 seconds at 120 degrees or 8 minutes at 80 degrees. How does that affect the medicinal qualities of the honey? And there are living enzymes in honey that will denature above 48 degrees. But the MGO, the methylglyoxal, and the polyphenols are quite stable at higher temperatures. So, I mean, if you're going to boil them for ages, you'll get some degradation. But generally, if you're heating them just for a short period, they're quite stable.
Fantastic. So the perfect thing to just dress something right at the end to give it that flavor kick without losing all of the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. The other thing I was curious about, and I get this comes up a lot in practice, that I have to avoid acidic foods because I get reflux. What are your views on that?
I would try an oxymol. So mixing having the acidic food with something like a honey that soothes. Because if you have straight vinegar, it can burn your esophagus. I mean, vinegar can be quite acidic, but when you have it with honey, you get the burn, but then you get the soothing. And I'm a big fan of Chinese. I have a PhD in Chinese medicine as well as being a Western medical doctor. And I love the 5 elements and the leaves, roots, flowers, fruits, and fungi. But the 5 different flavors: sweet, salty, spicy, sour, and bitter. And we need a balance of those flavors. And I think in the modern world, people have a lot of sweet, salty, and spicy, not so much sour and bitter. Now, sour, any fermented food, lemon juice is sour, and most fermented foods, sauerkraut, kombucha, they're all quite sour. Vinegars are sour. And bitter, most people I find, or that I talk to, get their bitter, I say, where do you get your bitter from? And generally in the past, it would have been from greens, rocket and radicchio and from salad greens. But most people now get their bitter from coffee and chocolate, which are quite bitter. But people crave bitter. And if you have more bitter, it'll reduce sweet cravings.
Yeah.
So if you have a lot of sweets and you're always craving sweets, if you add bitter, it's an easy way to then just reduce your body's cravings for sweet. So you can actually play with your own taste buds. And, if you're having a lot of salt, well, then you need to balance the salt with, sweet and sour and these other flavors. And so, yeah, generally, I think the food companies, they have a thing called the bliss point, where they'll add sugar, fat, and salt to the point where it just gives you the most dopamine hit and makes it addictive. So we have to fight against that. Mind you, I've been combining, I'm doing this product development for the honey and the vinegar company, and I've been combining the best quality sugar, fat, and salt. So we've got the fat from algae, and there's a red algae called Dunaliella salina, which is it grows on salt lakes. So it's one of the most salt-tolerant life forms on Earth. And when the salt lakes dry out, this green phytoplankton that's a sea algae turns red with beta carotene and zeaxanthin and lutein and all these great carotenoids, which are the fat soluble red, orange, yellow chemicals that protect ourselves from sunburn. They should protect the algae from sunburn. So that's got fat and salt, and they're mixing that with honey, and you end up with this salty, seaweedy honey that's amazing. So blending these flavors. So if say you get acid reflux from acid, well, then dilute the acid with some of these other flavors. So the acid generally are sour flavors. So maybe add some bitter and sweet. And I even find with the oxymoles, they're more enjoyable adding a bit of bitter and even a little pinch of salt, which enhance the flavors rather than just having a single flavor at a time. And that goes to one of the lines in the poem: avoid the naked carbs. Having carbs which are just sort of sweet, or just having sweets on their own. And I think naturally, we don't just eat bread by itself. We have bread with butter or cheese or some fat on the bread. But it helps, balance that. And if you're going to have something really sweet, I mean, even honey is amazing with cheese, or some nut butter, or some sort of fat or protein that you can have with the sweetness to balance it. So if you're having acid reflux, I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons for that, and I'm not going to give medical advice over a Zoom.
No, that's fair.
But there's, if it's just experimenting with the flavors and seeing how that sits with you. And very often when you balance your flavors, you're also balancing your microbiome. And when you balance your microbiome, that helps with stabilizing mood, stabilizing blood sugar, a whole range of, and then suddenly meal times, you don't crave foods. And when you're craving food, you're more likely to eat the wrong things.
Yes. And that's, I mean, that's an evolutionary response. Our body, when it went too long without enough, sweet food kept us alive for a little bit longer. So it's kind of that we haven't evolved that far.
And I tell you, it was really interesting when I was wearing my Vively glucose monitor, because I was saying that, how do I spike it? So I was having some oxymoles in the morning, vinegar and honey combinations, and they wouldn't spike it. Yeah. And then I was at a conference up in Ballina, run by Southern Cross Uni. I'm still an adjunct professor at Southern Cross and had this natural product futures forum, but they brought out these Danishes and Anzac cookies. I said, okay, my first meal of the day, I'm going to see how I can spike my sugar. So I had an Anzac cookie and a Danish, and went up to 9.5, which was the highest I ever got during the time I was wearing it. And then the whole day I was in this roller coaster. I couldn't concentrate, and I went up and down. I thought, and I tried to balance it with some vinegars afterwards. But it was really interesting to have, normally honey would spike your sugar, your blood glucose, although not nearly as much as straight sugar would, because especially if it's high quality honey, because of those polyphenols, which we talked about. But having it with vinegar really balances that. So yeah, having those combinations, I think, is really, really powerful.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you talk about those roller coasters and tuning into how your body feels. I'm a big, like, we don't have the data all the time, but we have our body and we can listen to what our body is telling us when we notice these things. But some really interesting research shows that when you have more glucose spikes and crashes, you actually consume up to like 300 to 400 calories more. And I mean, we're not talking necessarily calories, but if this is what you're experiencing every single day, your appetite is like sky high. You're looking for these fixes constantly. And it makes a lot of sense when you start to flatten those curves to be like, oh, actually, I don't need a meal in between lunch, or I can go a little bit longer until I start my first meal for the day. But that's because my body is more regulated and more balanced rather than restricting.
And that's it. If you start your day off well, I mean, I sort of push back on breakfast is the most important meal of the day, because I think you can delay your breakfast and wait till you're hungry and eat. But what you have for that first meal when you break your fast, if you have a savory with, some fiber and protein and fat first thing, it sets you up for a much better day rather than going through a cereal with sugar and then having this roller coaster of up and down. And I guess you can see that on the app. If you've got your Lively app, you can actually see that.
It's so interesting, isn't it? The other thing, I guess, that I did want to pick your brains about was there's obviously so many kombuchas on the market at the moment, and this has really exploded in the last few years. But I was curious, like, obviously there's so many different types, but a lot of them have artificial sweeteners. And I was wondering if that actually counteracts the benefit, because we know artificial sweeteners interrupt gut microbiome as well. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, it's a bit of a rort actually, because a lot of there's no regulation that says what is kombucha, so they can make it anything. And there is an issue with, if you want to, mainstream kombucha companies, they struggle with having living products, because living products can turn into hand grenades and explode, because of the fermentation. So they have to be, they're not shelf stable. They have to be cold chain logistics. And that's why when I said to Dina, my business partner, I want to have a vinegar which is shelf stable. You don't have to refrigerate it. But what they do then, they want to sell a living product. So they'll add a lab-grown bacteria, like a lactobacillus that's been grown in the lab, and they'll inject that at the end after they've pasteurized all the natural bacteria. And they'll say, bottle with 8 billion colony-forming units, which aren't going to survive. But then to make it sweet, they add these natural or these artificial sweeteners. Because if it had a living bacteria with sugars in it, it's going to start to ferment. So the artificial sweeteners are a way of having non-fermentable sweeteners that then keep it shelf stable. That's with the intention for disrupting bacterial growth. However, bacterial growth is really important. We are bacteria. We've got more bacteria in our bodies than human cells, and we are in service of the biome, which is in our gut. And the way I think about it is, and there's also like a bit of a misnomer that it's the bacteria that you eat that you want to colonize your gut with. And that's not necessarily the case. You have your microbiome in your gut, which changes quite slowly, and it's fairly constant over time. You can change it, but it's when you have probiotics or living foods, whether it's sauerkraut or kimchi, and when we think about most traditional cuisines would have something living with every meal. A couple of tablespoons of sauerkraut or kimchi or pickles or yogurt, or something that's alive, that's not dead. When you have living food, that helps to regulate your gut microbiome. And when you have artificial sweeteners, your gut microbiome doesn't know what to do. So you get this signal that, sugar, and you can get overgrowth and bloating, and you're actually giving confusing signals to your body. So they use these artificial sweeteners to literally to stop bacterial growth, and to give you sweetness without sugar, but it ends up sort of backfiring, I guess, because what happens in our guts, we need the fiber, we need the soluble fibers, but also the insoluble fibers for our gut bacteria to work on. And I guess we've lost that. And even in our modern diets, most of the food we eat in the modern world is fermented food. if you think about bread and cheese and wine and beer and tea and coffee and even chocolate, they're all fermented foods, but they're not living foods. They've lost their livelihood, their bacteria, because they're being cooked and killed. So, and before, maybe 100 years ago, before electricity was everywhere, we didn't have refrigeration. So people would have, as a standard, would have had, fermented foods, as sauerkrauts and ferments as a way of preserving food. They would have been living food with every meal. That's what we've evolved to eat. And the fact that we've lost that means we have so much gut dysbiosis, so many issues, and also this blood sugar regulation that's going up and down and up and down. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of it. I also not the taste of a lot of artificial sweeteners, doesn't sit well with me. And the sugar is not evil. It's just sugar over, the sweet overpowering the bitter and the salty and the spicy and the sour is bad for us. So we need to balance those things. And when you have balanced, I love chocolate. I love chocolate cake. I love eating sweet things. But then I don't overdose on them, crave on them, because I have a balanced flavor profile. And sometimes, and recently I've been making all these new kombucha flavors and kombucha vinegars. So I'm tasting a lot of vinegar. So I'm sort of overdosing on sour. So I have to consciously I need something really spicy and salty now, or something, sweet, and I'll be having a lot of honey because these Manuka honeys are amazing. But I need to then balance that with some of the other flavors that I haven't been having, just to balance my own metabolism. And when you think about that, that's something you can be really in control of, which flavors you're craving and which flavors you're having a deficiency of. And when you tune into what flavors you need, you get more in touch with your body. And I guess having the blood sugar monitor again will help balance that. I had this sweet, if I have this savory first, and salty and spicy, I don't get that rise that I'm getting when I just pig out on bread and honey.
Amazing.
The ultimate balancing act, isn't it? And I think what you've just described quite beautifully is really tuning into your body. So I love intuitive eating, listening to your body, asking yourself, what do I need right now? What is my body telling me? But at the same time as well, we live in this culture that is so removed that our body knows best, and that the diet, it's a whole other conversation, but the diet industry is such a massive industry in the world that it's taught us that we don't know what our body needs and we don't have the skills to listen. So while we can say, just listen to your body, it might actually be saying, do you notice hunger? If not, that's where we start. So like scaling it back a little bit.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people don't even realize, what it's like to be really hungry, because they're always eating, and what it feels like to be thirsty.
Yep.
And often when you feel like you're hungry, having just a drink of water is really satisfying. And there's a whole, we don't want to talk about water because that's a whole other can of worms. Maybe I'll have to come on again because, in tap water, there's diabesogens and obesogens in our water supply.
Okay, Marc, we're going to have to stop you there.
Okay, because I don't want to open up another can of worms. There is so much
exactly.
About, but it's so interesting.
But we'll get you back.
Yes, but thank you, Michelle. We have pulled us up on our time limit for today. So Marc and Michelle, thank you so much. I've learned so many new fun facts, particularly about some of those molecules that we can really use, but equally just some really handy tips to take in just in general, I think. So thank you so much for sharing.
And I'm really about things people can do at home. This is not rocket science. This is what our ancestors have been doing for millennia, and you can play with this at home. To make ferments at home is super easy. To add some, honey, or find out your local beekeeper and play with your own flavors and experiment with your own hunger and tuning into that is. I really encourage people to do that because it's the key to good health.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So Marc has got an amazing website too, which is Dr. Marc, which is marc.co. So check out his website. There's just so much on it,
and all my poems are there. So people want to check out
poems, but you research and loads of really entertaining. So you can spend a couple of hours on Marc's website. But we'll definitely get you back, Marc. Chat through water again and any of those other things. I'm sure you've got more to share with us in 6 months' time or so.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for hosting this. This has been really fun. I love sharing this information, and I do have, like, I've got to declare, I've got commercial interest in this. I've got a vinegar company. I'm working with a honey company. I've got my books. I've got all these activities. Water filter company that I work with. But I only do these things because I wanted to get out there, and I pretty much everything I do, I encourage people to do by themselves at home. So, I'll sell you stuff, I'll try and find the best stuff to make it available. But these are all things that people can do at home by themselves.
That's fun too. It's fun.
And that's actually a great little segue as well, because we do have our Facebook community, so our Vively community. So I will be posting on there a picture of my kombucha vinegar, which I didn't realize I had. But if you want to ask more questions, reach out to us in our community, and also to keep updated with our upcoming Fireside Chats as well. So we won't have any more until the new year, but thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you, Marc. Thank you, Michelle. As always, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Marc. Thanks, everyone, for joining.